Good evening and welcome back. There is a painting in the royal collection that people have been stopping in front of for more than 250 years. It hangs in a world of formal likenesses and gilded frames, surrounded by kings in armor and statesmen in robes and noble women arranged in the poses that the art of the period used to signal dignity and wealth and permanence. All of them are painted to project a specific image into the world. All of them are doing the work that official portraiture has always done, which is to show power in its most legible and sanctioned form. And then there is this canvas. She is young in this image, 17, perhaps 18 years old. She is dressed in ivory satin with a wide formal skirt and a bodice trimmed with lace at the chest. Her dark hair is powdered and dressed in the fashion of the early 1760s. Her posture is composed, the posture of a woman who has been taught that stillness is a form of authority, and who has absorbed the lesson thoroughly. Her hands are folded. Her expression is measured. Everything about the composition signals what she has become in the months since she sailed from the German coast and stepped ashore in England. A queen consort, a royal wife, a woman placed at the center of the most powerful monarchy in the world. But people keep stopping in front of this painting. They come closer than they intended to. They look at the nose, at the fullness of the lips, at the breadth of the jaw and the placement of the cheekbones, at something in the arrangement of the features that they cannot quite define and cannot quite walk away from. Some of them have read about a genealogical theory. Some of them arrived in the gallery with a specific question already forming. Some of them, perhaps the most interesting ones, did not know the question existed before they walked in, and have found it assembling itself in their minds with a quality of genuine surprise. Was she, this woman, in any meaningful sense, a woman of African descent? That question has been asked in whispers for more than a century. It has moved from the margins of genealogical scholarship to the center of popular culture, with a speed that reflects something about our own moment and what it needs from the past. It became louder and more public in the 1990s, when a historian assembled documentary evidence and presented it to a wider audience. This became louder still in recent years when a streaming series built an entire narrative around the possibility, and it has become, in the process, entangled with everything our own time asks about race and representation, and who gets to appear in the stories we tell about power. The question does not have a simple answer. The evidence is layered. The genealogy is real and contested at the same time. The chain of descent runs back 5 centuries through a web of intermarriage and dynastic calculation that crosses the width of the continent, from the Baltic coast to the Atlantic shore, from the medieval German duchies to the southernmost tip of Portugal. The painting in its gilded frame cannot tell you what the argument requires it to tell you. It can only show you what a Scottish artist chose to show when he looked at the young German woman who had just become the Queen of Great Britain. Tonight we are going to follow that question. We are going to begin where Charlotte herself began, in a small duchy on the Baltic coast that nobody outside the Holy Roman Empire had ever needed to think about. In a modest castle beside a flat grey lake, in a world of morning prayers and keyboard lessons and the smell of pine forest in the long German winter. We are going to move backwards through the centuries and across the continent, through the web of royal marriages and the slow accumulation of ancestry that defines every European dynasty. We are going to meet the Slavic princes, who were Charlotte's earliest traceable ancestors, and the medieval German lords they became, and the Portuguese king at the center of the claim, and the woman whose name is the turning point of the whole argument. We are going to spend time with that woman who lived in a world the modern eye can barely reconstruct. And we are going to sit honestly with the question of who she was and what the sources actually say about her, and what those sources are worth. We are going to look at the portraits, and the written descriptions, and the academic debate that has been running for 30 years. We are going to try, at the end, to say something true. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to drift into sleep, or to follow this story through 5 centuries of European history, I am glad you are with me. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Let us begin with Charlotte. Before she was a queen, in the world she came from, The Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in the 1740s was a place that most of Europe had no occasion to think about. It occupied a stretch of the southern Baltic coastal plain in what is now northeastern Germany, a landscape of flat, heavily forested land interrupted by a large number of shallow lakes whose surfaces reflected the sky with an indifference to season that gave the whole region a quality of quiet monotony. In winter the lakes were grey and the forest was grey, and the wind arrived from the water with a cold directness that left nothing warm in its path. In spring the birches put out their small pointed leaves and the light lasted a little longer each day, and the land briefly seemed to soften. In summer there were weeks when the sky was genuinely blue, and the evenings went on until nearly 10 o'clock, and the lakes reflected the long northern twilight in colors that could have been described as beautiful without any dishonesty. Then the autumn came again with its smell of damp leaves and cooling earth and the certainty of another grey winter approaching. The duchy was, by the standards of the great European powers, negligible. Its territory covered an area roughly equivalent to a modest English county. Its total population was perhaps 100,000 people. Its revenues were limited. Its political influence outside the complex internal diplomacy of the Holy Roman Empire was essentially non-existent. It had no major port, no significant manufacturing industry, no army of consequence, no scholarly or artistic institution that drew attention from the wider world. It was a principality existing within the elaborate ceremonial structure of the empire, fulfilling its obligations, maintaining its dignity at the level its resources allowed, and otherwise proceeding through the decades with the patient, unspectacular persistence that small states require if they are to survive at all. The Anade capital, Strelitz, was a planned town built essentially from scratch after a fire destroyed the original settlement in 1712. It was redesigned and rebuilt through the 1730s, laid out in the orderly geometric manner that the 18th century preferred for its urban spaces, with wide regular streets converging on a central square, the ducal palace at one end and the court church at the other, the residences of the court officials, and the better-off merchants arranged along the sides in neat rows. It was a purposeful town rather than an organic one, the product of design rather than of gradual accumulation, and it had the slightly artificial quality that planned towns tend to have, a tidiness that real towns that have grown from something messier, do not possess. But Charlotte was not born in near Strelitz. The ducal family's actual residential seat was Miro, a village on the western edge of the duchy, and it is to Miro that we need to go to find her. Miro sat beside one of the larger lakes of the region, a flat expanse of water that changed color with the weather and with the season but never quite ceased to be gray at its edges. Where the reeds grew thickly along the shallow banks and the willows trailed their branches into the water and the herons stood in the shallows with the patient stillness of birds that have learned that patience is the most reliable form of hunting. The village itself was small, a collection of houses around the church and the castle, working people's houses alongside the administrative buildings of the ducal household. The smells of a small agricultural community mixing with the more particular smells of a court, horse, leather, wood smoke, the warm yeasty scent of the kitchens when the baking was done. Mo Castle was not a palace in any sense that would satisfy a modern imagination conditioned by Versailles or Windsor, or the great Italian princely residences. It was a low, long structure of pale rendered stone, 2 principal stories in the main block, with a small chapel attached to the side and the usual array of outbuildings for horses and storage and the various departments of a working ducal household. The rooms were not large, the ceilings were not high, the furniture was good but not extravagant, the kind of furniture that a prosperous nobleman of the period would have found adequate and that a great court would have found modest. The windows in the principal rooms looked out over the lake, and on clear days the view was genuinely pleasant, the water and the sky meeting at a horizon defined by the dark line of the far shore's pine forest. In the village itself, outside the castle walls, the lives that surrounded Charlotte's childhood were the lives of working people. Farmers who held small parcels of land under the obligations of the ducal territory, who ploughed and sowed and harvested according to a calendar that had not changed substantially for centuries. Fishermen who went out on the lake in flat-bottomed boats in the early mornings, when the mist was still on the water and the light was barely beginning. Craftsmen, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a cobbler, the people who kept the functional life of a small community running. Servants in the castle itself, from the steward and the chaplain and the ladies-in-waiting at the top of the household hierarchy, to the kitchen maids and the stable boys and the laundry workers at the bottom, whose days began before the duke or duchess was awake and ended long after the family had retired, who lived in the attic rooms and the basement quarters and the outbuildings, and whose names do not appear in the records that history has kept. Charlotte's father was Duke Charles Louis Frederick, who had inherited the duchy and its obligations and its modest revenues, and who managed them without any particular distinction and without any notable failure, which was perhaps all that could be asked of the ruler of a small principality in the middle of the Holy Roman Empire. He died in 1752, when Charlotte was 8 years old. He was 44, which was not an unusual age to die in the mid-18th century, and he died of causes that the historical record does not describe in detail, which usually means illness of a kind so commonplace that the chroniclers did not think it worth specifying. Charlotte's mother, Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen, was a different order of person. She was the daughter of a small German court, and had arrived at Miro with the practical and moral intelligence that her own upbringing had instilled, and which the demands of widowhood and the management of a large family would have the opportunity to fully demonstrate. She was a woman of strong Lutheran piety and considerable practical capability, and after her husband's death she ran the ducal household with a combination of genuine warmth toward her children and firm insistence on the values she considered essential. Order, piety, education, economy in all its forms. The household Charlotte grew up in was not poor. It was not the cramped and anxious poverty of the farmers in the village, who worried each autumn about whether the harvest would be enough, who repaired and re-repaired their clothing and their tools, who ate the same simple diet through the long winters and counted the distance to the next spring, with a calculation that was partly agricultural and partly existential. Charlotte's household was warm and properly fed and staffed by people whose labor made it function, but it was also genuinely modest by royal standards, and the modesty was not merely material but moral. Elizabeth Albertine did not believe in extravagance, and her children were not raised to expect. The fires in winter were kept burning in the rooms that were in use and allowed to go cold in the rest. The great draughty corridors of even a modest castle were cold in the way that old stone buildings are cold, a chill that settled into the walls and the floors and emanated from them all winter long regardless of what happened in the rooms on either side. The gowns Charlotte and her sisters wore were properly made and properly maintained, but they were remade and altered as the girls grew, as all clothing was in households that counted what things cost. In an era when textiles were expensive and waste was a form of moral failure. The table was nourishing and sufficient. The produce of the duchy's farms and the lake's fishing, and the castle's kitchen garden, prepared with the solid competence of a German court kitchen that knew its business, but without the elaborate artifice and the imported ingredients that a great court kitchen deployed as displays of wealth. What the household gave Charlotte instead of luxury was education. Elizabeth Albertine believed in the cultivation of the mind as both a practical and a moral matter, and she directed her children's education with that belief as her organizing principle. Charlotte was taught music from an early age and became genuinely accomplished at keyboard instruments. Not in the decorative, sufficient for a parlor sense that the word accomplished sometimes implies when applied to women of the period, but in the real and technically demanding sense that comes from sustained practice and actual talent. She played with seriousness and with pleasure, two qualities that do not always arrive together and that together produce musicianship rather than merely performance. She was taught botany, which became one of the consuming intellectual passions of her adult life. The gardens at Kew, which she would later help develop into one of the great botanical collections in the world, had their foundation in the serious attention she had been giving to plants since childhood. She was taught languages, German as her mother tongue and French as the language of courts and diplomacy, the second language of every educated person in Europe in the 18th century. the medium through which Charlotte would have to conduct herself at court and in correspondence for the remainder of her years. She read widely and with genuine interest, and she kept reading for the whole of her long life, accumulating the kind of wide and various mental furniture that serious reading across decades produces. The days at Miro had a rhythm that Charlotte absorbed into her bones, a rhythm that would remain the deep structure of her life even after everything around her changed beyond recognition. Morning prayers before breakfast, the smell of the chapel, cold stone and candle smoke, and the freshly laundered linen on the altar cloth. Lessons through the late morning, music or languages or botany or the domestic arts that a noblewoman was expected to have mastered. A midday meal at a table the family ate together. The sound of multiple voices and multiple ages, the ducal children ranging from Charlotte down through several younger siblings, the chaplain perhaps a tutor, the senior ladies of the household. Afternoons of continued study or walking along the lakeside path, the path that ran between the castle and the water's edge through the reeds and the willows, where in spring the wild flowers came up through the grass, and the smell of the water was fresh rather than cold. Evenings of reading or needlework or music, a quiet supper, and then bed in a room where the fire had been built up by a servant and was slowly giving its warmth to the cold stone air. Consider a particular morning at Miro in January perhaps, when Charlotte is 12 years old. The first sound she hears is not from her own room but from below, from the kitchen, where the cook has been at the range since 5 o'clock, rebuilding the fire from the banked coals of the night before. The scrape of the ash rake and the clatter of the iron door carry through the cold stone building to anyone whose room is on the kitchen side. And Charlotte's room is on the kitchen side, because she is the 8th child and the rooms with the lake view went to the older children long before she arrived. She dresses herself largely without help, as a child who has been trained by Elizabeth Albertine to physical self-sufficiency from an early age. The stays and the petticoats and the morning dress, each layer in its proper order, laced and tied with the brisk competence of a girl who has been managing her own fastenings since she was old enough to reach them. Her mother considers dependence on servants for the management of one's own body a form of moral weakness, and Charlotte has absorbed this conviction so thoroughly that she would maintain it for the rest of her life, even when she has dozens of servants available for the purpose. The room is cold, her breath is visible in the air, until the fire in the grate, lit by a housemaid an hour ago, has had time to take the worst edge off the chill. The housemaids have been working since before 5. They move through the castle in the dark, in the particular quiet of servants who know that being heard by the family is the same as being noticed, and being noticed for the wrong reasons is the beginning of trouble. They carry their equipment with them, the coal bucket, the black lead polish, the brushes, the dustpan. They kneel in front of the cold grates and rake out the previous day's ash and polish the iron surround until it catches the first light and lay the new fire with paper and kindling and coal in the arrangement they have been taught. The arrangement that will catch with a single match if it is done correctly and produce a steadily increasing warmth that will have the room comfortable by the time the family comes down. The kitchen maid who is on first duty is 13 years old, the daughter of a village craftsman who sent her to work at the castle because the position comes with food and a bed and a small wage. She fills the water pots from the well in the kitchen yard each morning, a task she does in the dark and the cold, going out through the kitchen door into the bitter January air with a lamp in one hand and the bucket handle in the other. The seared well handle is stiff with the cold and requires both hands to work. The water in the bucket begins to chill before she has carried it back inside. She does this every morning. Charlotte eats her breakfast in the breakfast room with the rest of the family. The table is set for the whole household's senior members, the children, the Duchess, the chaplain, whatever tutor is in residence. The bread is fresh, baked in the castle kitchen from the duchy's own grain, and it has the dense, slightly sour quality of German country bread that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life, and that the English bread she later ate would never quite replicate. The butter is from the castle dairy. The milk for the younger children is warm. The coffee that Elizabeth Albertine drinks is sweetened with a modest amount of sugar, which is imported and not cheap and is used sparingly, the way everything in this household is used sparingly. The music lessons happen in the room that serves as both schoolroom and music room, a room on the ground floor with a window facing the lake and a keyboard instrument that Charlotte has been playing since she was 7 years old. The music teacher, who comes from Strelitz, is a man of particular standards. He requires precision. Loves out people felt of words where Daniel in the passage is not right, and again, until the fingers have found the pattern and can reproduce it without the intervention of conscious thought. Charlotte sits at the keyboard and works through the exercises with the focused, slightly anxious attention of a student who is genuinely interested in the subject but has not yet reached the point where the technical demands and the musical understanding move together rather than in competition. That moment of integration will come in her early teens, and it will be one of those experiences of real learning that a person carries for the rest of their life, the moment when the mechanics become invisible and the music is simply there. The lakeside path in the afternoon is Charlotte's particular territory. She walks it the way a naturalist walks, which is to say slowly, stopping frequently, attending to things that a less observant walker would pass without noticing. She has learned to identify the plants that grow along the water's edge by their leaf structure and their flowering habit. She knows which grasses prefer the drier ground above the waterline and which sedges prefer the wet ground at the margin. She knows the birds, the grey herons that stand in the shallows with a patience that seems almost philosophical. The ducks that arrive in autumn and leave in spring, the smaller wading birds whose names she has learned from the natural history books in the schoolroom. She carries a small notebook for recording what she sees, and the habit of recording, of looking at the world with enough attention to write down what is actually there rather than what you expect to be there, is a habit that will produce the botanical drawings of genuine scientific quality that she makes throughout her adult years. The evenings at Miro are the closest thing to leisure the household produces, and even the leisure has a quality of purposeful occupation that Elizabeth Albertine considers appropriate. The women of the household gather in the room with the fire. The needlework comes out. The conversation is quiet and general, the kind of shared talk that happens among women who know each other well enough that silence is also acceptable. Charlotte plays keyboard in the evenings with a freedom she does not have during the morning lessons, playing the pieces she knows well enough to play without effort, and the improvised variations that happen when the technical requirements of a piece have become transparent. Elizabeth Albertine sometimes plays too, the hymn tunes she has known since childhood, her hands finding the familiar shapes on the keys without needing her eyes or her conscious attention. The smell of those evenings is specific. The pine logs on the fire, the wool of the needlework, the faint rose water that the Duchess wears sparingly, the tallow of the candles that each woman works beside in her own circle of light. The sound is the fire and the needles and the occasional turning of a page and the wind outside, always the wind, working at the windows and the doors and the old stone walls of a castle that has been standing at the edge of this lake for longer than anyone in the household can remember. What Charlotte could not have imagined in any of those evenings was that a letter was being written in a government office in London, that a young king had recently inherited a throne and was being advised that he needed a wife, that his ministers had compiled a list of Protestant German princesses of suitable age and suitable family, that her name was on the list, that her name would, after months of diplomatic correspondence and the careful weighing of candidates, end up at the top of it. She was 17 years old when the English envoys arrived at Miro with the formal proposal. She was married to George III in September of 1761 at St. James's Palace in London. Having met her husband for the first time on the evening of the wedding itself, she did not speak English when she arrived. She had never seen London. She had never been to a court of anything approaching the scale she was entering, and she never went back to Miro. She left it behind entirely, the lake and the forest and the modest rooms and the cold corridors and the morning prayers and the keyboard practice and her mother's voice and everything that had made her who she was. And she entered a world that was larger and more demanding and more public and more permanent than anything that small Baltic duchy could have prepared her for. She became Queen Charlotte, consort to the King of Great Britain and Ireland. She remained in that role for 57 years, until her death in 1818. She had 15 children. She managed a household of thousands of servants, and a public life conducted under constant and uninterrupted scrutiny. She watched her husband's mind deteriorate across decades, the slow and terrible erosion of the man she had married at 17. She outlived several of her children. She managed the political turbulences of a reign that encompassed the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and the social upheavals that came with all of them. She was, by every account, practical and dutiful and privately funny and publicly composed. A woman who had absorbed her mother's lesson about getting on with things so thoroughly that she was still when the world had given her every reason to stop. And she carried, in her ancestry, the long accumulated inheritance of every person who had come before her, which is where we need to go next to understand what the genealogical claim about Charlotte actually requires. You have to understand something about how European royal ancestry actually worked. You have to understand that the family tree of any European royal born in the 18th century is not a simple diagram with two branches extending cleanly backward into the past. It is something much stranger and more complicated than that. The great royal and noble families of Europe had been intermarrying for approximately 1,000 years by Charlotte's time. They were constrained by religion and by rank, and by the political logic of dynastic alliance, to find their spouses within a pool of appropriate families that was, relative to the full population of the continent, very small. Catholic royals married other Catholic royals. Protestant royals married other Protestant royals. The pool of Protestant royal and noble families suitable for intermarriage in 18th century Germany was, in practical terms, a few dozen families at most. Over 1,000 years of this kind of deliberate constrained intermarriage, the genetic and genealogical consequences were significant. The consequence was that if you trace any European royal's ancestry backward far enough, you find connections to nearly every other royal house on the continent. Not in the loose and theoretical sense in which all human beings are ultimately related if you extend the timeline far enough back, but in the specific and nameable and documentable sense, through marriages that can be dated and verified and followed step by step through the archival record. The same ancestors appear multiple times in the same family tree, arriving through different routes. The genealogist's technical term for this is pedigree collapse, and in the European aristocracy, Charlotte descended from the Dukes of Mecklenburg, who had been ruling their Baltic territory in some form since the 12th century, but the Mecklenburg family's origins went deeper and older and stranger than the German ducal title suggested. Those origins lay in the Slavic world that German eastward expansion had absorbed but not entirely erased. In a language and a culture and a religion that had existed along the Baltic coast for centuries before German feudalism arrived and offered conversion or destruction as the only available choices. The territory that would become Mecklenburg was, before the 12th century, the heartland of the Obotrites. The Obotrites were a confederation of West Slavic peoples, known in the German sources as the Wends, who had occupied the southern Baltic coast and its hinterland for centuries. They were not a single unified people but a collection of related tribes sharing a linguistic heritage and a common cultural orientation. Their territory extended along the Baltic coast and inland through the Lake District and the forest, a landscape they knew intimately and that shaped everything about how they lived. They farmed the land between the forests. They fished the Baltic coast and the inland lakes, going out in flat-bottomed boats in the early mornings when the surface was still and the fish came close to the surface, hauling in their catch and returning to beaches where the women waited to begin the work of preserving and trading what the boats brought back. They kept cattle in the forest clearings. They traded with the Scandinavian peoples to the north and the German peoples to the west, amber and furs and saltfish moving through their territory along routes that had been established for generations. Their towns, what the sources call towns, were fortified settlements built on islands in the lakes or on ground surrounded by marshes. positions that were easy to defend and that gave their inhabitants a strategic advantage that partly compensated for their lack of the heavy fortifications that stone castle architecture would later provide. Their political organization was tribal rather than feudal. Authority rested in chieftains who derived their power from warrior reputation and from the support of their people rather than from the kind of hereditary legitimacy backed by royal or papal sanction that the German world was developing. Decisions about war and alliance and tribute were made in councils, in gatherings of the leading men of the community, not handed down from a single hereditary sovereign. This was a different kind of political structure from the one that the empire was built on, and it was a structure that the empire was not particularly interested in accommodating. Their religion was their own. A paganism of sacred groves and river spirits, and a calendar of seasonal ritual that had survived centuries of contact with the Christian world without yielding to it. The Obotrites worshipped gods whose names survive in the chronicles only in fragments, partly because the Christians who wrote those chronicles had no particular interest in preserving pagan theology with any accuracy, and partly because the Slavic sacred tradition was oral rather than written. And once the communities that carried it were disrupted and converted, the tradition was lost with them. What the chronicles do preserve is the sense of a religion tied deeply to the natural world, to the particular landscape of lakes and forests and the sea, to the creatures and the weather patterns and the seasonal rhythms that defined life on the southern Baltic coast. The sacred groves were the institutions of this spiritual life. They stood in a deep forest, places where trees had been left uncut across generations, where the canopy was thick enough to change the quality of the light beneath it from daylight to a greenish, filtered dimness that felt like a different kind of space entirely. The smell of a sacred grove was the smell of old forest undisturbed by the axe, deep leaf litter, the cold exhalation of ancient wood, the particular wet earth scent of fungi working through the fallen timber. The community gathered here for the rituals that marked the turning points of the year, the spring planting ceremonies, when the ground was softening and the risk of the new season's agriculture was about to be taken on by every family in the settlement. The summer solstice, when the light lasted longest and the world was as open and generous as it would ever be. The autumn harvest, when the community counted what it had and measured it against what the winter would require, and the winter darkness, the most serious of all. When the world contracted to its smallest and coldest point and the community gathered in the grove and performed the rituals that maintained the relationship between human need and the forces that governed the return of the light. The priests who tended these groves carried knowledge that was never written down. It was transmitted from priest to priest, generation to generation, through practice and memory, through the doing of the rituals rather than the description of them. When the Christian missionaries came with the German lords behind them, the groves were the targets. Cutting down a sacred grove was the single most efficient act of cultural destruction available. The trees were gone. The specific quality of space they had created was gone. The knowledge that had been maintained there, tied to that specific place and to the practices performed in it, had nowhere to go. Some of it persisted in memory for a generation, perhaps two, then it was gone entirely, and the people who had lived by it were in the same landscape without the framework that had given the landscape its meaning. The amber trade is worth understanding because it connects this apparently remote Baltic world to the wider world around it in ways that the popular image of isolated northern pagans does not suggest. The amber that washed up on the Obotrite beaches was the hardened resin of ancient coniferous forests that had grown millions of years ago in a landscape now submerged beneath the Baltic Sea. Storms broke it from the seabed and deposited it on the beaches, where it could be found mixed with seaweed and driftwood after a heavy sea, translucent and golden when held up to the light, warm to the touch in a way that stone was not. The Baltic peoples had been collecting and trading amber for thousands of years before the Obotrites existed. The amber roads that ran south from the Baltic coast to the Mediterranean were among the oldest trade routes in Europe, older than the Roman roads that would eventually parallel and absorb them. When Pliny the Elder described amber in the 1st century, he was describing a commodity that had been traveling from the Baltic to the Mediterranean for longer than written history could measure. The Obotrites were participants in this trade, and through it they were connected to a commercial world that stretched from the Scandinavian north to the Roman and Byzantine south. They were not primitive isolates. They were people with trade networks and diplomatic relationships and the kind of pragmatic intelligence about the wider world that trade always produces. The amber and the furs and the salt fish of the Baltic coast moved westward and southward through their territory, and in return came the metalwork and the glass and the goods of the wider European and Mediterranean economy. When the German Empire looked at the Baltic coast and saw territory worth taking, it was looking at a connected and economically active world, not an empty wilderness. The Obotrite chieftains appear in the Carolingian and Ottonian chronicles as a political fact that the German Empire could not ignore and could not easily contain. Sometimes the Obotrites were allies of the Franks, useful counterweights against the Saxons or the Danes in the shifting alliances of the early medieval Baltic world. Sometimes they were enemies, raiding the eastern border regions with a speed and ferocity that the German defenses struggled to manage. Sometimes they were trading partners, the amber and the furs of the Baltic moving westward through Obotrite territory toward the German markets. They occupied the borderland in every sense, geographic, cultural, political, religious, from the late 11th century onward, as the Holy Roman Empire consolidated and the German nobility began to understand the Baltic coast as territory worth acquiring and colonizing, rather than simply a dangerous frontier to be managed. The pressure on the Obotrite Confederation intensified steadily. The land was good. The rivers provided transport routes into the interior. The coastal position offered access to Baltic trade. And from the middle of the 12th century, the ideology of crusade, which had been developed for the wars in the Levant, crusade with all the legal and spiritual mechanisms that attach to it, the forgiveness of sins, the redistribution of the conquered land, the sanction of the papacy for violence that would otherwise require justification, was made available to German princes who were prepared to fight the Wends rather than the Saracens. It was from the perspective of the German nobility, a theologically convenient arrangement that happened to align exactly with their territorial ambitions. The Wendish Crusade of 1147 was the most organized and dramatic episode in this campaign. German princes from Saxony and Brandenburg and elsewhere, blessed by the papal legate and supported by the organizational machinery of crusade, launched a campaign against the Obotrites and the other Slavic peoples of the coast. The campaign was brutal. The Obotrite chieftain at this moment was Niklot, and he responded to the crusade with the fierce and pragmatic intelligence of a leader who understood precisely what was at stake and had no illusions about the nature of the forces arrayed against him. Niklot was not simply fighting for territory. He was fighting for the continuation of a world, a language, a religion, a way of organizing political authority, a relationship with a landscape that the Christianization and German feudalization of his people would make impossible to sustain. He raided the German settlements. He burned the towns that supplied the crusading forces. He negotiated when negotiation would buy him time, and attacked when attack would impose costs on the enemy. He played the various German princes against each other, exploiting the rivalries and competing interests that prevented the crusade from achieving the unified and overwhelming force it needed to be genuinely decisive. He survived 147. He survived the years after it. He was killed in 1160 fighting Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, in a campaign that ended his resistance permanently, but Niklot left sons. His elder son, Pribislav, made the calculation that his father had refused to make, or submitted to German overlordship. He accepted Christian baptism and the conversion that accompanied it. Tesses imnipsina delodidit the emperor over his territory, and in return he received his ancestral lands back, not as the territory of a Slavic chieftain but as a proper German feudal fief, held from the empire under feudal law, with all the rights and obligations that feudal tenure involved. This was the moment the House of Mecklenburg came into existence. not from German blood but from Slavic blood, converted and absorbed, retaining the land by accepting the framework that conquest had made the only alternative to dispossession. Pribislav had not surrendered in the simple sense. He had negotiated a survival, a transformation of terms that kept the family on its ancestral ground. His descendants would rule Mecklenburg until 1918, more than 7.5 centuries, longer than almost any other ruling dynasty in European history. The conversion was not a matter of a single baptism and a changed vocabulary. It was a transformation that worked its way through every aspect of life for the ruling family and for the people who lived under them. The sacred groves were cut. The timber was used to build churches, which was not merely practical but deliberately symbolic. The old sacred wood repurposed into the framework of the new sacred space. The physical material of one religion made to serve the architectural requirements of another, where the community had gathered in the grove at the solstice to perform rituals whose meaning was tied to the specific trees and the specific place. They now gathered in a stone church at Christmas and Easter to perform rituals whose meaning was determined by a theological system that had been developed in Rome and Jerusalem and Constantinople, in places none of them had ever seen. The priests who had tended the groves were gone. Some had been killed. Some had converted, accepting the new framework as Pribislav had accepted it as the price of remaining on their own ground. Some had retreated into the forest where the old ways could be practiced in secret for a generation or two before the last practitioners died and the knowledge died with. In their place came Christian clergy, German-speaking monks and parish priests who carried with them the liturgy and the calendar and the administrative systems of the Roman Church, and who set about the work of converting not just the chieftain's family but the entire population, village by village, household by household, over the following generations. For the ordinary people of the territory, the people who farmed the forest clearings and fished the lakes and who had no say in the political decisions being made above their heads, the transformation was real but gradual. The working rhythms of agriculture did not change because the religion had changed. The spring planting still required the same labor at the same time of year. The autumn harvest still required the same hands and the same knowledge. The fish in the lakes did not know or care what prayers the fisherman offered before he went out in his boat. What changed was the framework within which these activities were understood, the festivals that marked the seasons, the ceremonies that accompanied the planting and the harvest, the language in which the community spoke to whatever powers it believed governed the outcome of its labor. These things changed, gradually over generations, as the Christian calendar replaced the pagan one, and the church replaced the grove, and the priest replaced the priest. The Slavic language persisted in the population for longer than the ruling family used it. Place names preserved Slavic roots that the German overlay never entirely erased. The names of the lakes and the villages and the forest tracts retained their Slavic forms through centuries of German administration. The names outlasting the language that had produced them, evidence of a world that had existed before the conversion and that the documents of the German period mention only in passing. The farmers who worked the land around Miro in Charlotte's time may well have spoken a German that retained Slavic words for certain local features of the landscape, the way that English retained Norse words for the landscape of the Danelaw for centuries after the Norse speakers themselves were gone. What happened over the following centuries was the thorough integration of the Mecklenburg family into the broader European noble world. The mechanism was marriage, applied generation after generation with the consistency and the pragmatism that characterized every aspect of European dynastic politics. Each generation of Mecklenburg dukes married into other German noble families, the Hohenzollerns, the Wettins. Through those marriages they acquired not only political alliances but genealogical connections, each wife bringing with her the accumulated ancestry of her own family's centuries of intermarriage. The daughters of the Mecklenburg dukes went outward in the same way, married into other German courts, carrying the Mecklenburg ancestry forward through their children. A Mecklenburg daughter married to a Saxon count might herself be the granddaughter of a Bavarian duke who had married a woman descended from the French royal house. The connections multiplied with each generation, becoming denser and more complex. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Mecklenburg family's ancestry was a cross-section of European noble history itself. It contained threads that reached back to nearly every major royal house that had existed on the continent over the previous 500 years. But the genealogical record preserves everything, as genealogical records do, whether the living heirs know it or care about it. Somewhere in Charlotte's ancestry kidney, the Slavic warriors and lake fishermen and pagan priests of the Baltic coast sat alongside the German lords and the French nobles, and all the other tributaries from which the European aristocratic bloodline had been assembled over a millennium. And one of those tributaries, arriving from a completely different direction from the far southwestern corner of the continent, was the one that would eventually generate the debate that has surrounded her name ever since. To find that thread, we need to leave the Baltic coast and travel across the full width of Europe, past the Rhine and the great central German plain, past the Alps, past the Pyrenees, to the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, to the Kingdom of Portugal, in the middle of the 13th century, by 128, when the man at the center of this part of our story came to the Portuguese throne. Portugal was approximately 100 years old as a distinct political entity. It had been created through the intersection of military force and papal diplomacy and the gradual southward push of the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian North through territories that had been under Muslim political authority for 500 years. This process, which Christian historiography later called the Reconquista, was not a clean or linear military campaign. It was centuries of warfare interrupted by long periods of peaceful coexistence, of alliances between Christian and Muslim rulers against common enemies, of cultural exchange and intermarriage, and the slow transformation of a landscape shaped by two civilizations living in close and often productive proximity. The borderland between the Christian north and the Muslim south was not a fixed line on a map. It moved, it shifted with the military fortunes of each decade, and the territory on either side of it was not the homogeneous domain of a single culture, but a zone of mixing, where Christian and Muslim and Jewish communities lived in the same towns and spoke each other's languages and used each other's administrative systems and ate food prepared with techniques that had crossed the boundary in both directions over centuries. A Christian merchant in a border town might speak Arabic as his working language. A Muslim farmer in a recently conquered territory might attend a Christian church while maintaining private practices that belonged to the tradition he had been raised in. The boundaries between the two cultures were porous in every direction, and the people who lived in the borderlands navigated them with the pragmatic flexibility that survival in a contested landscape always requires. The children of mixed unions were not uncommon in these border zones. Christian men who married Muslim women, Muslim men who married Christian women, Jewish families whose commercial networks crossed all religious boundaries. The mixed population of medieval Iberia was not a marginal exception to the rule of cultural separateness. It was a substantial and visible part of the social reality. The genealogies of noble families on both sides of the religious boundary reflected this mixing, though the later generations who compiled those genealogies sometimes preferred to smooth over the parts that did not fit the official story of clean religious and cultural identity. This was the world in which the encounter between Afonso III and Madragana took place, whatever the specific circumstances of that encounter. It was a world in which the meeting of a Christian king and a woman from the Muslim administrative class of a recently conquered territory was not exotic or inconceivable, but was one of the ordinary human transactions that conquest and proximity always produce painless. The Reconquista was not a collision between two sealed worlds. It was a long, slow, complicated renegotiation of the terms under which people who had been living in the same landscape for 5 centuries would continue to live there under changed political authority. The southernmost region of Portugal, the Algarve, had been the last substantial territory still under Muslim political authority when King Afonso III came to the throne. Its name was Arabic, its towns had Arabic names and Arabic administrative structures. Its farmers practiced the sophisticated irrigation agriculture that the Islamic civilization of Iberia had developed over centuries. Its scholars and physicians and architects had been trained in the Arabic intellectual tradition that was, in the mid-13th century, still considerably more sophisticated than the Christian European learning that was beginning to catch up. Faro was one of the principal towns of the Algarve. It sat on the southern coast, looking out toward the Atlantic, a town of whitewashed walls and flat-roofed buildings and the narrow streets that the Islamic urban planning tradition preferred, streets that kept out the summer sun and channeled the sea breeze to cool the interiors. It had a harbor where fishing boats went out with the tide and came back with it, and the harbor smelled of salt and rope, and the particular sharp smell of fresh fish drying in the sun on the stone quay. It had a market where the produce of the Algarve was traded, the figs and the almonds and the olives and the oranges that the Islamic agronomists had introduced and that the landscape now grew with the abundance of a crop well suited to its soil and climate. It had a mosque with a minaret from which the call to prayer had organized the rhythm of the town's day for generations, and it had by the mid-1240s been conquered by the Portuguese. The physical town did not change overnight. The whitewashed walls were still white. The narrow streets were still narrow. The harbor was still the harbor. The houses still had their internal courtyards, and their tiled floors and their thick walls that kept the interiors cool through the Algarve summer. When the heat could press against the outside of a building with a weight that felt almost physical and the cool shade inside was not merely pleasant but necessary. What changed was the sound. The church bells replacing the muezzin's call, the Portuguese spoken in the administrative offices where Arabic had been spoken the week before. The different cadence of a different language in the market and the harbor and the streets. The smell of the town changed too, gradually, as the new Christian authorities introduced their own dietary habits and their own festive calendar, and the cooking that went with it. Pork where the Muslim population had not eaten pork, wine had not publicly drunk wine, the slow replacement of one culinary world by another. The conquest did not empty Faro of the people who had lived there. It changed the authority under which they lived. The mosque became a church. The administrative vocabulary shifted from Arabic to Portuguese and Latin. The official calendar changed, but the people who had inhabited those whitewashed houses for generations, whose families had been on this coast for a century or more, whose fathers and grandfathers had fished from this harbor and traded in this market, remained, and the administrator who had governed the town under Muslim authority may well have remained too, at least for a time, because the conquerors needed people who knew how the local systems worked, and practical politics in the aftermath of conquest tends to prefer useful collaborators over principled displacement. The people who lived through this transition, the ordinary people of Faro, who were not administrators or nobles, experienced it as a series of practical changes rather than as a single dramatic event. The fisherman whose boat went out at the same time and returned experienced the change in the prayers he was expected to offer and the holidays observe. The woman who sold almonds in the market experienced it in the new language she had to learn to conduct her trade. The children experienced it in the school that was different, and the stories that were different, and the calendar of festivals that was different. The transition was real and it was permanent, and it was felt in every household. But it was not sudden. It was a slow grinding transformation that took generations to complete, and in the meantime the two cultures existed in the same streets, and sometimes in the same households. The Arabic and the Portuguese spoken side by side, the old practices and the new ones coexisting in the way that cultures always coexist when one has been superimposed on another by force. Afonso III had spent years before his kingship at the court of his Aunt Blanche of Castile, the mother of Louis IX, the French king who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. The French court had given Afonso a particular intellectual and administrative orientation, a taste for governance as a serious and systematic enterprise rather than as the improvised management of competing noble interests that it more often was in medieval Iberia. He came to the throne by deposing his brother Sancho II, who had been declared by Pope Innocent IV to be incapable of governing his kingdom effectively. which in practice meant that Sancho had lost the confidence of enough of the Portuguese nobility and clergy that removing him was politically achievable. Afonso III was, by the standards of his time and place, a capable king. He consolidated the legal system, worked to regularize taxation, pushed the final southern border into the Algarve, and conducted a reign of sufficient competence that the kingdom he inherited in disorder was in rather better order when he died in 1279. He was also a man who, in the tradition of medieval European royalty, maintained relationships with women outside his formal marriage. One of those women was the person whose name sits at the center of every discussion of Queen Charlotte's ancestry. Her name was Madragana. She appears in the historical record with the particular opacity that history reserves for women who were not wives, who were not saints, who did not found dynasties in the official sense, who mattered to the people who knew them in ways that the people who wrote the records did not consider worth preserving in detail. She appears not through her own actions or her own voice, which is gone entirely, but through her children, and specifically through the fact of who their father was and what that paternity made possible for them. The name itself is a small historical puzzle. It does not appear in the Portuguese naming tradition of the period in any straightforward way. Scholars have noted that its sound and structure are consistent with Arabic-sized personal names, the kind of name that might belong to a woman whose family had been part of the Arabic-speaking world of southern Iberia, whose personal name had been formed in the phonological and cultural context of that world rather than in the Latin-derived naming conventions of the Christian nobility. This is not proof of anything. Names move between cultures and traditions in ways that resist simple interpretation, but the name is one of several details that have pointed scholars toward the question of her background. The traditional identification comes from Portuguese genealogical compilations, written in the 16th century, approximately 300 years after Madragana's lifetime. These texts, produced by genealogists working to organize and formalize the complex record of the Portuguese royal lineage, identify her as the daughter of a man named Alejandro Paes. They describe him as the Moorish alcalde of Faro. The word alcalde is itself Arabic in origin, from alcadi, the judge, which tells you in miniature something significant about how thoroughly the administrative vocabulary of the two cultures had been exchanged in the centuries of coexistence and conflict. An alcalde was an official with both judicial and administrative functions, a man of standing and local authority, someone who knew how the town worked and how its people were governed. If this account is accurate, then Madragana was the daughter of a Muslim administrator in a recently conquered southern town, a woman who had grown up within the Arabic-speaking culture of the Algarve, who would have known the particular domestic world that Islamic Iberian society had produced. That domestic world was not primitive or impoverished. The Islamic civilization of medieval Iberia was sophisticated in ways that European popular imagination has consistently underestimated. The civilization of Al-Andalus, which is the name historians now use for the Muslim-ruled territories of the Iberian Peninsula, had produced for 5 centuries a culture of remarkable intellectual and aesthetic quality. Its scholars had preserved and translated the texts of classical antiquity that were largely lost to the Christian European world, transmitting Aristotle and Plato through Arabic and into Latin in translations that would help produce the European intellectual renaissance of the 13th century. Its physicians practiced a medicine derived from Galen and from the accumulated empirical observation of centuries, more systematically organized and more empirically based than the medicine available in most of Christian Europe. Its mathematicians made advances in algebra and trigonometry. Its astronomers built the observatories. Its architects produced buildings of an elegance and technical sophistication that can still stop a modern visitor in a palace courtyard or a mosque interior in a way that technical description cannot fully account for. The agricultural knowledge of Al-Andalus was equally significant. The Islamic farmers and agronomists of Iberia developed irrigation systems of considerable engineering sophistication, managing water in a semi-arid southern landscape with a precision that transformed what the land could produce. They introduced new crops from the east: rice, sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits, spinach, artichokes, crops that transformed the diet and the economy of Iberia in ways that outlasted the political end of Muslim rule by centuries. The knowledge of how to grow these crops, how to manage the water that made them possible, how to preserve and process them, was part of what the conquest absorbed, even as it replaced the flag above the administrative buildings. For the working people of the Algarve, the people below the level of administrators and nobles, the conquest meant a change of masters rather than a sudden transformation of daily life. The fishermen still went out each morning in their boats. The farmers still cultivated the same fields with the same crops and the same irrigation channels. The craftsmen still made the same things in the same workshops. The change was in the structure of authority above them, in who collected the taxes and who issued the legal judgments, and what religious calendar governed the public rituals of the community. For these people, the question of Madragana's ancestry was irrelevant and unknowable. They were getting on with the work of surviving, as working people always are, underneath the arguments of the powerful about who owned the world they inhabited. The fishermen who went out from Faro Harbour at first light in the years after the Portuguese conquest had his nets to think about and the weather to read and the particular quality of the water that told him, through accumulated years of experience, where the fish would be today. The harbour was the same harbour it had always been. The boats were the same boats. The skills were the same skills, passed from father to son, and from one generation of fishermen to the next in the specific, practical way that working knowledge is always transmitted. By watching, by the particular attention that comes from needing to get something right, because your family's food depends on it. He prayed differently now, or was expected to. The sound that organized his morning was a church bell rather than the call to prayer that had organized his grandfathers, but the sea did not care about any of this, and the fish did not care, and the work of going out and coming back and mending the nets and selling the catch was the same work regardless of who was in charge of the town. The farmers in the irrigated fields of the Algarve interior were managing water systems that the new Portuguese authority did not fully understand and could not have replaced if the systems had been damaged. The irrigation channels that brought water from the hills to the flat coastal plain, the systems of sluices and distribution points that allowed the same water to serve multiple fields in sequence, the knowledge of when to open which channel, and how to read the signs that told you the system needed repair. All of this was in the hands of the people who had built the channels and maintained them for generations. The Portuguese administrators needed these farmers to keep doing what they had always done. The alternative was a famine in a territory that had just been conquered. So the farmers continued, the fields continued, the irrigation channels continued. The citrus groves that the Islamic agronomists had established and the rice paddies in the river valleys and the cotton fields and the sugarcane all continued, because the knowledge of how to grow them was in the hands and the habits of the people who lived there, and that knowledge could not be replaced by Portuguese administrators who had never seen a rice paddy or maintained an irrigation sluice. The craftsmen who built in the whitewashed Algarve style continued building. The houses of the Algarve, with their thick white walls and their flat or gently pitched roofs and their internal courtyards and the particular way they were oriented to catch the breeze off the sea and shade themselves from the afternoon sun, were the product of centuries of building knowledge, adapted to the specific climate and materials of the southern coast. A Portuguese noble who wanted a house in the Algarve was going to get a house built by the same men who had been building houses there for generations. Because those men were the ones who knew how to make a building that was comfortable in that climate. The style survived the conquest because the climate had not changed, and the people who knew how to build for it were still there. If Madragana was the daughter of the Moorish alcalde of Faro, she would have grown up in one of the better houses in the town. Not the grandest, perhaps, but a house that reflected her father's status as a man of administrative authority. The Islamic domestic interior of the Algarve had a specific quality. It was organized around the courtyard rather than the street, oriented inward toward the family's private space rather than outward toward the public world. The sound of water was often present, a fountain or a channel running through the courtyard, the sound of moving water being one of the great luxuries of a dry climate and one of the elements that Islamic domestic architecture had refined to an art. The floors were tiled, the walls plastered, the rooms arranged to create sequences of shade and light that were both aesthetically deliberate and practically effective at managing the heat of a southern summer. She would have heard Arabic spoken in the household. She would have known the rhythms of a Muslim domestic day, the 5 prayer times that divided the hours, the dietary practices, the particular calendar of fasting and feasting that organized the year. She would have smelled the food of the Algarve kitchens, which was the food of 5 centuries of Islamic Iberian culinary development. The spiced meats and the rice dishes and the sweets made with almond and honey that the Arabic-speaking population had developed from the ingredients the landscape provided. This was not the cooking of the northern Portuguese Christian court. It was something else entirely, a cuisine with its own history and its own vocabulary and its own complex of flavors that the conquest would gradually absorb and transform, but would not entirely erase. For Madragana herself, wherever she sat in this world, the historical record is almost entirely silent. She bore Afonso III 2 children who are named in the genealogical sources, and whose paternity the king acknowledged. The older was a son, Martim Afonso Chichoro, born around 1250. The younger was a daughter, Urraca Afonso, born around the same period. They were illegitimate children in the technical legal sense, born outside any formal marriage, but the status of royal legitimacy in medieval Europe was considerably more complex and more viable than later centuries would make it. An acknowledged royal bastard had access, through that acknowledgement, to a social world that no commoner's child could enter. The paternity opened doors. It made marriages possible that would otherwise have been inconceivable. Martim Afonso Chichoro was legitimized and married twice, leaving descendants who intermarried into the Portuguese nobility across subsequent generations. Urraca Afonso also married and left descendants, and from those descendants, through the slow accumulation of generations of European noble intermarriage, the genealogical thread runs forward through the 14th century, and the 15th and the 16th and the 17th and the 18th, touching noble houses in Portugal and Spain and France and Germany, until it arrives, according to the theory that Valdesi Corcom traced, at Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. But the question of who Madragana actually was is not settled by the genealogical sources, and this is the place where the scholarly debate is most genuinely unresolved. The sources that identify her as the daughter of a Moorish alcalde are, as noted, written 300 years after her lifetime. The chronicles and administrative records of Afonso III's own period, the documents written while she was alive and her children were growing up at the Portuguese court, do not describe her origins in any detail. They name her children. They record the king's acknowledgement. They do not tell us where she came from, or what cultural world she inhabited, or what language she spoke when she was not at court. This silence is not unusual. Southern Balaromitrams were not interested in the origins of royal concubines as a category of person worth documenting, but it means that the claim about her Moorish ancestry depends entirely on the authority of sources written 3 centuries later, sources that may be drawing on genuine oral or documentary traditions that ran back to her lifetime, or may be filling a gap in the record with a plausible inference drawn from the geographical and historical context, or may be doing something else that we cannot now reconstruct. Any of these explanations is possible. None of them can be confirmed or ruled out on the basis of what the documentary record provides. 16th century genealogical sources themselves require careful understanding if they are to be used as evidence for anything. These were compilations produced by court genealogists in an era when the formal organization of royal lineages was both a scholarly enterprise and a political one. The men who compiled them were not inventing histories wholesale. They drew on archival research, on earlier compilations that are now lost, on oral traditions that had been transmitted through noble families across generations, and on their own informed judgment about what was plausible given the historical context of the persons they were documenting. They were serious scholars working with incomplete materials, and their work contains genuine historical information that cannot be obtained from any other surviving source. But they were also working in the service of particular political interests. The organization of a royal lineage was not a neutral scholarly exercise. It established claims of precedence and inheritance and legitimacy that had practical legal and political consequences. The genealogists made choices about what to include and what to omit, what to emphasize and what to pass over, based on calculations that were not purely scholarly, and when the documentary record ran out, as it frequently did for persons of lesser status in the earlier centuries, they filled the gaps with inference, connecting the documented facts with the plausible narratives that would make the lineage cohere as a continuous story rather than as a collection of fragments separated by holes. The identification of Madragana as the daughter of a Moorish alcalde may be one of these inferences rather than a documented fact. A woman with an Arabic-sounding name associated with the recently conquered Algarve, whose children were acknowledged by the king who had completed the conquest of that territory, the genealogists of a later century. Whether those circumstantial reasons were adequate substitutes for contemporary documentation is the question that the debate ultimately turns on, and it is a question that cannot be answered with certainty because the contemporary documentation does not exist. Some historians have argued that Madragana was simply a Portuguese woman of Christian background, whose connection to a Moorish administrator was a later interpolation added to the genealogy by compilers working from insufficient information. Others have accepted the traditional identification and focused their analysis on what it means for the chain of descent. The argument has not been resolved because the primary sources are insufficient to resolve it. And the honest response to insufficient sources is to hold the uncertainty clearly rather than collapsing it in the direction that suits any particular argument. There is a further complication which concerns what the word Moorish actually meant in the medieval Iberian context, and this requires some care. The word Moor is one of the most imprecise and most consequential words in the whole debate. In modern popular culture, shaped by Shakespeare's Othello, and by centuries of theatrical and filmic representation, a Moor is understood to mean a black African man. This image is so firmly established that it has become nearly inseparable from the word itself. And it is not an accurate representation of what the word meant in medieval Iberia, or what it would have meant to the people who used it to describe Madragana and her father. The armies that conquered Iberia in 711 were composed predominantly of Berbers. The Berbers were the indigenous peoples of North Africa, the populations who had inhabited what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya since before recorded history, who had been part of the Mediterranean world through Carthaginian, Roman, Byzantine, and Vandal domination, who converted to Islam in large numbers following the Arab conquests of the 7th century, and who made up the majority of the military forces that crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Iberia. They were not sub-Saharan Africans. The word Moros in Latin, which became Moor in English, originally referred to the Maori, a Roman period designation for the peoples of northwestern Africa. In medieval European usage it was applied with great inconsistency, sometimes to North Africans specifically, sometimes to all Muslims regardless of geographic origin, sometimes to Arabic-speaking people regardless of their ethnic background, and occasionally to dark-complexioned people generally in contexts where darker skin was associated with southern or eastern origins. It was not a racial classification in the modern sense. It was a cultural and religious marker broadly and inconsistently applied that could in principle describe a very wide range of people. In medieval Iberia specifically, the population living under Muslim rule was itself extraordinarily mixed. There were Arab settlers from the Arabian Peninsula, a small elite minority who had come over in the initial conquest and in subsequent waves of immigration. There were Berber settlers from North Africa, the majority of the Muslim population. There were Visigoths, the Germanic people who had ruled Iberia before 711, and many of whom converted to Islam over the following centuries. There were native Iberian people of Roman and pre-Roman heritage who had converted to Islam across the generations. There were Mozarabs, Christians who continued their faith under Muslim rule while adopting Arabic language and many elements of Arabic material and intellectual culture. There were Jewish communities who had been in Iberia since at least the Roman period, and who navigated the legal and social spaces available to a defined minority population under both Muslim and Christian governance. When the Portuguese genealogical sources of the 16th century describe Madragana as Moorish, they are almost certainly describing someone connected to this complex and mixed world. They are not, in any historically defensible reading, describing someone of sub-Saharan African origin. The connection is to North African Berber heritage, or to the culturally Arabic population of Iberia, or to some mixture of the two, none of which maps cleanly onto the implied connection to sub-Saharan African heritage that underlies the most common popular version of the Queen Charlotte story. This distinction is not made to diminish the claim. North Africa is geographically and politically part of the African continent. A person of North African Berber heritage has African ancestry in a literal and accurate sense, but the implied connection in the popular version of the story, suggestion that Charlotte was a woman of color in the sense that term carries in contemporary British and American racial discourse, the sense that connects to the history of the Atlantic slave trade and the colonial subjugation of sub-Saharan Africa, requires a much larger and less documented leap than the genealogical evidence actually supports. Precision about what is and is not being claimed matters enormously in any honest engagement with this history. And then there is the mathematics of genetic inheritance, which adds a further dimension to the question of what the genealogical claim actually means for any living person at the far end of the chain. From Madragana, who may have lived in the mid-13th century, to Charlotte, born in 1744, is approximately 500 years, depending on the generation length involved. That is roughly 20 to 22 generations of descent. The mathematics of how genetic material is transmitted across generations are straightforward and somewhat humbling. Each generation, a person inherits approximately half their genetic material from each parent. After 20 generations, the fraction of any single ancestor's genetic material that, on average, survives in a living descendant is approximately 1 in a million. This is not a precise figure because of the role of chance in inheritance, and it is modified by the patterns of inbreeding that were common in aristocratic families, where the same ancestors appear multiple times through different roots in the same family tree. But the general principle is reliable. After 20 generations, the genetic contribution of any single ancestor is, biologically speaking, negligible. What this means for the Charlotte claim is not that the genealogical descent is false, but that it does not mean what a modern audience is likely to assume it means. If Charlotte descended from Madragana, and if Madragana had North African ancestry, Charlotte did not experience that ancestry in any visible or socially legible way, in any way that would have been apparent to her or to the people around court and society she inhabited. The ancestry was there in the genealogical record, buried 20 generations deep, contributing a fraction of her biological inheritance too small to be relevant. She was not a woman who carried the experience of African ancestry in the way that the popular version of the story sometimes implies. Charlotte was also far from the only person in whose ancestry this thread could be found. The Portuguese royal line that produced Martim Afonso Chichoro and Urraca Afonso intermarried extensively with the Spanish nobility in the 14th and 15th centuries, and through those connections with the French nobility in the 14th and 15th centuries, and through those connections with the French nobility and through the French with the German, and through the German with the English and the Danish and the Swedish, in the endlessly branching pattern that 5 centuries of European dynastic marriage inevitably produces. If the descent from Madragana is accepted as documented, then Charlotte was one among dozens, perhaps hundreds, of European aristocrats who shared the same distant ancestor through one route or another. The Spanish royal family carried the same thread through different branches of the Portuguese noble houses that had intermarried with the Castilian and Aragonese crowns across the medieval period. Members of the French nobility who had married into the Iberian dynasties carried it into the great noble houses of France. The Habsburgs, who married strategically into nearly every royal house in Europe across the 16th and 17th centuries, may well have picked up the thread through their extensive Spanish connections. The same line that connects Charlotte to Madragana could, in principle, connect dozens of other European royals to the same 13th century woman, through paths that genealogists have not bothered to trace because the question about Charlotte's ancestry has not been asked about those other descendants. This is not an argument that the claim is meaningless. It is an observation about how European noble genealogy actually works, and about why singling out Charlotte as a unique case is historically misleading. The web is too dense and too interconnected for any single distant ancestor to belong exclusively to any single descendant. The claim about Charlotte's ancestry is a claim about a system, not about a person. It was a claim about the extraordinary interconnectedness of the European aristocracy and the way that a single medieval individual's genetic and genealogical contribution could propagate through that system across centuries and borders until it reached Kabsheim. People who had no knowledge of it, and no reason to suspect it. The reason Charlotte became the specific focus of the debate, rather than any of the dozens of other European royals who may share the same distant ancestry, is partly circumstantial and partly cultural. She was Queen of Great Britain at the height of the British Empire and Atlantic slave trade. She was queen of a country that was simultaneously the world's largest slave-trading nation and the country that would eventually abolish the slave trade. A contradiction that defined her reign, even if it was not a contradiction she personally resolved. The irony that the queen of the slave-trading empire might herself have had African ancestry, however distant and however dilute, has a particular resonance that the same claim about a minor Spanish duke or a French provincial count would not possess. If a claim about Charlotte matters, to the people for whom it matters, because of who Charlotte was and what she represented, not because her genealogy is different from anyone else's. What made her case the specific subject of visual scrutiny, rather than merely one genealogical thread among the hundreds that make up any royal ancestry, was the painted likenesses and what people saw in them, or thought they saw, or projected onto what they saw when they looked at them. Alan Ramsay was a Scottish-born painter who became one of the most successful portrait painters working in London in the middle of the 18th century. He was appointed principal painter in ordinary to George III in 1761, a position that brought with it the commission to produce the official coronation portraits of both the king and queen, and to oversee the production of the multiple copies of those portraits that were distributed to government buildings, royal palaces, official residences, and grand houses across the British world. The coronation portrait was the monarchy's official self-presentation to the nation and the empire, and everything about it was deliberate: the composition, the costume, the lighting, the expression. The coronation likeness of Charlotte, painted in 1762, shows her in full court dress with the full apparatus of royal ceremony: the crown on her powdered hair, the ermine at her collar, the wide silk skirt spreading around her, the formal posture of a woman performing the role of queen with complete external conviction. In this image, as in all formal state portraiture of the period, the conventions of the genre do as much work as the painter's observation. The flattery is structural. The arrangement of the composition is calculated to project majesty and dignity rather than to capture any particular individual truth. It tells you a great deal about what a queen was supposed to look like in 1762 and rather less about the private face of a 17-year-old German girl from a modest Baltic duchy who had arrived in London a year earlier knowing almost no English. Ramsay also painted Charlotte in less formal contexts, and in those images the face is different, more particular, more individual. The nose is broader than the idealized nose of the period's beauty culture. The lips are fuller than the convention of fashionable portraiture generally produced. The jaw is wider than the fashionable oval that portrait painters routinely imposed on their sitters, regardless of the actual shape of the face before them. Whether this represents Ramsay's unusual commitment to honest observation in an era that rewarded flattery, or whether it represents the specific physical appearance of a woman whose features did not conform to the Northern European standard, cannot be established with certainty now. Portraiture is interpretation, not recorders. A painted likeness passes through the artist's training, the period's aesthetic conventions, the patron's wishes, the physical conditions of the sitting, and the artist's own aesthetic preferences before it arrives on the canvas. Artists of the 18th century routinely modified what they observed. They lengthened noses, softened jawlines, brightened eyes, narrowed mouths, elevated complexions toward the fashionable ideal that Ramsay, known among his contemporaries for the quality and fidelity of his likenesses, may have preserved something true about Charlotte's features is entirely possible. That a viewer 3 centuries later can reliably read racial ancestry from those features is a different and more difficult claim. There are also other portraits of Charlotte by other painters across the decades of her long reign. Thomas Gainsborough painted her. Benjamin West painted her. Johann Zoffany painted her in the informal family groups that became one of the distinctive types of royal imagery in the Georgian period. Arranged in domestic settings, the composition suggesting intimacy and natural family life in a way that the formal state portrait did not attempt. These images by different painters vary considerably in how they render Charlotte's features. Gainsborough softens and idealizes, because softening and idealizing was what Gainsborough did. Zoffany, working in a more documentary mode in his conversation pieces, places Charlotte in domestic scenes where the face is smaller and the overall composition carries the meaning rather than the individual features. No single coherent image of Charlotte emerges from the complete collection of her portraits. What emerges is a set of interpretations, each shaped by the painter, the occasion, the conventions of the specific genre of portraiture being employed, and the intentions of whoever commissioned the work. The attempt to extract a racially significant physical truth from this variety of interpretations is an exercise that tells you as much about the interpreter as about the subject. If you arrive in the gallery believing Charlotte had African ancestry, the broader nose in the informal Ramsay portraits will confirm what you already believed. If you arrive without that belief, the same features will register as individual variation within the normal European range, or as evidence of Ramsay's comparative honesty in an age of universal flattery, or as the natural consequence of lighting conditions and the angle at which the sitter happened to hold her head during a particular sitting. The paint does not change. The question you bring to it changes everything about what the paint appears to say. The written descriptions of Charlotte's appearance are specific and frequently cited in the debate, and they require careful handling. Baron Christian Friedrich von Stockmar was a German physician from the Duchy of Coburg who became one of the most trusted advisors of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, a man with extraordinary access to the British royal family across several decades of the 19th century. His memoirs and correspondence survive in German, and they contain a passage describing a portrait of Charlotte that has been quoted in the Ancestry debate many times. Stockmar described the portrait as showing features that he associated with what he called, in his German, a Mulatto-Gesicht. The word translates as mulatto face, and mulatto, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was a term drawn from the vocabulary of the Atlantic slave trade and its elaborate racial classifications. Used specifically to describe a person of mixed European and African descent, historians who support the ancestry theory have cited this passage as meaningful evidence. An educated European man who had no obvious motive to invent racial characteristics, who knew the royal family intimately, used a specific racial term to describe what he saw in a portrait of Charlotte. This is not a trivial observation, but several complications arise. Stockmar was writing about a portrait, not about a living person. He was a physician and a courtier, not a trained taxonomist of racial characteristics. He was writing decades after Charlotte's death, in a document that was not intended as a formal genealogical or racial analysis, but as personal correspondence and memoir. The German of his period used the word mulatto with a range of meanings that extended beyond the technical colonial usage. It could describe a tawny or olive complexion, a brownish coloring, a skin tone darker than the Northern European norm, without necessarily implying African ancestry. A swarthy German or a sun-darkened Frenchman could be described with a term that in colonial contexts carried a very specific and different charge. Other contemporary descriptions of Charlotte cluster around the observation that she was not beautiful by the standards of the English court, that her features were strong rather than delicate, that her complexion was dark, that her nose was broad. Horace Walpole, who described everything and everyone with the particular relentlessness of someone who understood himself as the age's social chronicler, left observations about Charlotte that have been variously interpreted by the people who cite them. The diplomat who reported back to London on the English proposal of marriage described Charlotte as not beautiful but sensible and well-mannered and entirely acceptable. These are not descriptions of beauty. They are not, however, descriptions that identify Charlotte as a woman of color in any explicit sense. They are descriptions of a woman who did not conform to the fashionable Northern European ideal of female appearance. What Charlotte's contemporaries did not do, and this is significant, was describe her racial identity as uncertain or remarkable or even worth discussing. The British court, the British public, the British press, all of them were living in a society with an acute, legally elaborated, and economically motivated consciousness of racial categories. The Atlantic slave trade was at its height during Charlotte's queenship. The British Empire was managing millions of enslaved and colonized people whose legal status depended on racial classification. The newspapers and pamphlets and parliamentary debates of the period discussed race and slavery and colonial governance, with a frequency and specificity that makes clear that this was a society that knew what racial categories were and applied them with great precision to anyone who fell outside the white European norm. Charlotte was not so categorized. She was received and treated and described as a white German princess who had become the white English queen. The court gossip, which was extensive and covered every aspect of her life, the state of her marriage, the progress of her pregnancies, her relationships with her children and her husband's household, and the political factions that competed for influence, did not include any discussion of her racial identity. The newspapers that were willing to describe her physical appearance in unflattering terms, that noted her dark coloring and her strong features in the context of assessments of whether she was beautiful enough for English taste, did not treat those features as evidence of racial ambiguity. This pattern of social categorization is not in itself proof that the ancestry claim is wrong. The categorization of people of mixed or ambiguous ancestry in the 18th century was often determined more by social position than by genealogy. And Charlotte's social position was as unambiguous as it was possible to be. She was the Queen of Great Britain. A woman at the apex of the British social hierarchy was going to be categorized as white and European regardless of what any genealogical archive might eventually reveal about distant ancestors. The social consensus about her identity tells you how 18th century English society worked, not necessarily something definitive about the genealogical question, but the social consensus is worth examining in more detail, because the society that produced it was not casual or imprecise about racial classification. This was a society in which the legal status, the economic position, the personal liberty, and the basic human dignity of millions of people depended on exactly these classifications. The plantations of the Caribbean and the American colonies operated according to racial categories that had been codified in law with extraordinary specificity. The children of mixed unions were classified according to systems that calculated racial fraction with mathematical precision. Quadroon, octoroon, each term denoting a specific degree of African ancestry and carrying specific legal consequences. A person who was 1/8 African in their ancestry had a different legal status from a person who was 1/4 African, and both had a different status from a person who was considered entirely European. These were not abstractions. They were the terms under which actual people lived and worked, and were bought and sold. For such impelled global that observed Charlotte and commented on her appearance and gossiped about her household, and her marriage, and her children, was a public that understood these categories with the precision that economic self-interest always produces. The newspapers that were willing to say unflattering things about Charlotte's looks, that described her as dark and strong-featured, and not a beauty by English standards, were newspapers published in a society that had every reason to notice and comment on any evidence of non-European ancestry in a person of public prominence. The satirists who mocked everything about the royal family, who were not restrained by any modern concept of lèse-majesté from saying whatever they pleased about the king and queen, did not satirize Charlotte's racial identity. This is not conclusive evidence of anything, but it is worth noting. The people most motivated and most equipped to notice racial ambiguity in a public figure did not notice it in Charlotte, or at least did not comment on it. The most that can honestly be said is that the silence of Charlotte's contemporaries is consistent with the most obvious explanation. It is also consistent with a less obvious but not impossible explanation. The Queen's racial identity might have been managed or suppressed or simply not recognized by a court and a society whose interests required her to be what they had decided she was. Both explanations are available. Neither can be ruled out on the basis of the surviving evidence. Mario de Valdés y Cocom, the historian whose research brought this argument to widespread public attention, he had been investigating Charlotte's genealogy for years before he presented his findings in 1996. His work reached a broad audience through print journalism and through a documentary series on PBS. It generated discussion both within the academic genealogical community and in the wider public conversation about race and history. His argument was careful and specific in its strongest formulations. He was not claiming that Charlotte was black in the contemporary identity political sense. He was claiming that she had documented African ancestry through the Madragana line. He argued that this ancestry had been consistently overlooked by historical establishments with no interest in acknowledging non-European heritage in the British royal family. The recovery of this history, he believed, constituted an act of justice toward people of African descent who had been systematically erased from the historical record. His methodological argument was pointed. He observed that genealogical claims about European royal ancestry were routinely accepted on the basis of exactly the kind of 16th-century Portuguese and Spanish genealogical sources that critics of the Charlotte theory found insufficient when those sources pointed toward non-European heritage. If the evidentiary bar for genealogical claims was being raised specifically and selectively when the ancestry in question was African, that was a problem with a political dimension that deserved to be named as such. The observation was not without force, and the academic community's response to his research was not uniformly distinguished by the disinterested rigor it claimed. Professional genealogists who examined the specific chain of descent generally concluded that it was possible but not proven at every link, that the identification of Madragana as Moorish rested on sources of uncertain authority, and that the description of Charlotte as a woman of African descent required leaping from a thin and distant genealogical thread to a claim about her lived identity that the evidence did not fully support. They acknowledged the mathematical reality of pedigree collapse. They pointed to the social categorization of Charlotte. They noted that even accepting all the premises, the characterization of Charlotte as a woman of color was a rhetorical and political choice rather than a strictly genealogical conclusion. The debate arrived in popular culture with the force of something that had been waiting for an audience. The Netflix series Bridgerton and its spin-off Queen Charlotte made a creative decision to cast a black British actress as Charlotte and to treat the ancestry theory as the foundation for an entirely reimagined version of Regency society, constructing a narrative in which Charlotte's identity as a woman of color had profound personal and political consequences for the world she inhabited. The series was not claiming to be documentary history. It was explicit that it was engaging creatively with a historical possibility, building a story in which the possibility was realized. The consequence was that tens of millions of people who had never encountered the genealogical argument encountered a powerful and emotionally resonant version of it, simplified into the clean lines that narrative requires, without the qualifications and the uncertainties that the scholarly argument contains. Whether the popular simplification has served historical understanding is a legitimate question. Popular history always simplifies. The simplification is what makes it popular. The question is whether the simplifications are honest simplifications, or whether they firm up the contested and uncertain into the established and known. In the case of Charlotte's ancestry, the popular version has a tendency to present as settled what remains genuinely uncertain, and to describe as meaningful what is, in the genealogical and biological sense, vanishingly thin. But the counter-argument is also available, that the popular version has made the actual historical question, with all its complexity, the subject of genuine public interest and discussion, and that is not nothing where a under. The enduring fascination with the question, the reason it persists in the public imagination in ways that other genealogical debates about other European royals do not, has everything to do with what the question represents beyond its specific historical content. When audiences around the world responded to the reimagined Charlotte with an intensity that surprised even the people who had made the decision to cast her as they did, they were responding not to a genealogical argument but to a possibility. The possibility that a woman of color could have sat at the center of the most powerful monarchy in the world at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. The possibility that the relationship between Europe and Africa was more intimate and more complicated and more deeply woven into the fabric of European power than anyone had been told. The possibility that the line between white and black, which the 18th century drew with such apparent confidence and such devastating consequence, was not a line at all but a gradient, and that the people on the powerful side of it may have had more in common with the people on the other side than anyone had been willing to acknowledge. This is why the question will not go away. It is not a question that can be answered with a genealogical chart and a mathematical calculation about genetic dilution, even though the genealogical chart and the mathematical calculation are part of the honest engagement with it. It is a question about what kind of past we are willing to have. This conventional past, the one that has been taught and accepted and repeated for centuries, is a past in which Europe and Africa are separate worlds that meet only through the violence of the slave trade and the colonial encounter. The past that the Charlotte question opens up, whether Charlotte herself was part of it or not, is a past in which the two worlds were intertwined for 1,000 years before the slave trade began. Through the Islamic civilization of the Mediterranean, through the Berber conquest of Iberia, through the intermarriage and cultural exchange, and the slow mixing of populations that 5 centuries of shared geography inevitably produced, the medieval Mediterranean was not divided into the clean racial categories that the 18th century would later impose. The Moors who governed Iberia were not a homogeneous population. The Christians who reconquered it were not a homogeneous population either. The boundaries between the two were porous in every direction. People converted in both directions, married across the boundary, produced children who belonged to both worlds, carried knowledge and language and culinary traditions. The Charlotte debate, whatever its specific genealogical merits, has forced a broader public to confront this history in a way that academic scholarship alone had never managed. The fact that a popular television series accomplished what decades of scholarly publication had not, is itself significant and worth thinking about. What the entire debate reveals, beyond its specific genealogical content, is something about the relationship between history and the needs of the present. The desire to find Queen Charlotte in the lineage of people of African descent is not fundamentally a genealogical desire. It is an imaginative and political desire. It reaches for a past that looks different from the one we have been given, that contains within it the people who have been excluded from the official story of European power. It insists that the boundary between the European and the African world, between the Christian and the Islamic world, between the north and the south of the Mediterranean, was a boundary that people crossed with a regularity that European historical narrative has never fully acknowledged. It refuses the clean and falsely homogeneous version of European history in which the royal families and the ruling classes were always and entirely what they presented themselves as being. These are not dishonest desires. The history of Al-Andalus, the civilization that governed the Iberian Peninsula for 500 years, is a history that belongs to Europe as much as the history of Charlemagne or the Plantagenets. The Berber and Arab scholars who preserved Aristotle and translated Galen and built the Alhambra and developed the mathematics that became algebra were genuine contributors to the civilization that produced the world Charlotte was born into. Even if the Christian European narrative has consistently preferred to forget them, the presence of people of color in European courts and cities and institutions across the medieval and early modern periods is a documented historical fact that the dominant narrative has underweighted. The desire to recover that presence, to insist on its reality, to find it in unexpected places, is a historically legitimate impulse even when the specific evidence for any particular claim falls short of certainty. Whether Charlotte herself was part of that story, in any genealogically meaningful sense, remains genuinely uncertain. The most accurate sentence the evidence permits is modest and careful. Charlotte may have descended, through a long and partially documented chain of European royal intermarriage, from a woman connected to the Moorish culture of medieval Portugal, who was probably of North African Berber heritage, and whose contribution to Charlotte's ancestry after 20 generations was genealogically traceable but biologically negligible. That is what the evidence allows. Charlotte herself knew none of this. She did not know about Madragana. She knew who she was in the only sense that governed her life, a German princess who had become an English queen, who had borne 15 children and buried several of them, who had watched her husband's mind disappear and managed the consequences of that disappearance with a steadiness that history has not always given its due credit. The life she actually lived, as opposed to the genealogical life that scholars would later reconstruct from the archives, was a life of enormous scope and enormous constraint operating at the same time. She arrived in England in September of 1761, speaking almost no English, entering a court whose social codes and political factions and domestic hierarchies were entirely unknown to her. Married to a man she had met for the first time a few hours before the ceremony, in a country whose climate and food and conversation and social rhythms were nothing like what she had known at Miro. She had to learn everything at once: the language, the etiquette, the political relationships, the household management of a court that employed thousands of people and spent more in a month than her mother had spent in a year. She did learn it. She learned it with the practical intelligence and the capacity for sustained attention that Elizabeth Albertine had built into her, and within a year or two the observers who had noted her awkwardness and her accent and her unfamiliarity with English customs had stopped noticing those things and started noticing instead her competence. She bore her first child, the future George IV, in August of 1762, less than a year after her marriage. She bore her 15th and last child, Princess Amelia, in 1783. Over those 21 years she was pregnant or recovering from pregnancy almost continuously. The pregnancies were managed by the physicians of the period with the medical knowledge of the period, which is to say with a combination of genuine observation and theory that would strike a modern observer as alarming. She survived all 15 deliveries. Not all of her children survived their childhoods, and the loss of a child was, for Charlotte, as for any mother of the period, a grief that the public performance of queenship could not accommodate, but that the private woman carried regardless. The household she managed at Buckingham House, which would later become Buckingham Palace, was a vast domestic operation. Its complexity would have been familiar in its basic structure to anyone who had managed a large household. Its scale would have been familiar to no one who had not been inside a royal court. There were departments for every functions: the kitchen, the laundry, the stable, the wardrobe, the nursery, the household accounts, the maintenance of the buildings themselves. There were hierarchies within each department, and hierarchies between departments. A constant flow of supplies and personnel and decisions required someone's attention and authorization. Charlotte brought to this the organizing intelligence she had learned from her mother, applied at a scale her mother could not have conceived of, and she managed it with the same basic orientation. Competence from the people who worked under her, The king's illness is the central fact of Charlotte's private life and the fact that the public record most consistently understates. George III's condition, which modern medicine has variously attributed to porphyria, to bipolar disorder, to a combination of both, or to causes still debated, first manifested in episodes of disturbed behavior in the 1780s. The episodes were initially temporary. The king would become agitated, would talk rapidly and at length, without apparent coherence, would experience physical symptoms that the physicians of the period, and then would recover and resume his duties, and the episode would be treated as an aberration rather than a pattern. Charlotte managed these early episodes with discretion. Because discretion was what the situation and the monarchy required, the episodes became more frequent and more severe. The crisis of 1788 and 1789, when the king was incapacitated for months and Parliament debated a regency bill that would have transferred his authority to his son, was the most public and the most damaging. Charlotte found herself at the center of a political crisis she had not caused and could not control, managing the household and the family while the politicians around her maneuvered for advantage, and the newspapers reported on her husband's condition with a combination of concern and relish that the modern media would recognize. The king recovered, that time. He did not always recover afterward. By the last decade of his life, George was entirely absent from the world around him. He was confined to Windsor, cared for by attendants, living in a reality that existed only inside his own mind. He believed he was still governing. He held conversations with people who were not present. He did not know what year it was or what had happened in the years he could no longer access. Charlotte managed the public consequences of this situation with the particular competence of a woman who had been managing difficult realities quietly for the whole of her adult life. She kept the household running. She kept the family functioning in its public role. She maintained the appearance of stability that the monarchy required, because the alternative was a public acknowledgement of dysfunction that the institution could not afford. She did this largely alone in the sense that the work of managing it fell to her and could not be delegated. She had advisors and she had household officers and she had the support of some of her children, but the weight of it was hers. The daily decisions about how the king should be cared for, about what the public should and should not be told, about how the household should be organized around a man who was physically present and mentally absent, about how to maintain her own composure and her own health under the pressure of a grief that never quite ended because the person she was grieving for was still alive. All of this was her work, and she did it for years. She managed her botanical work alongside everything else, which is itself remarkable. The collections at Kew, which she and George III had supported in collaboration with Joseph Banks, grew into one of the genuinely significant botanical repositories in the world during her lifetime. She continued to make botanical drawings of scientific quality. She continued to correspond with naturalists, the intellectual life she had begun at Miro, looking at marsh plants along the lakeside path and making careful drawings of what she saw, had developed into a genuine contribution to botanical knowledge. Sustained across decades of a life that would have given most people every excuse to abandon anything that was not immediately and urgently necessary, she played keyboard music. She played it well and she played it consistently throughout her life in the same rooms and eventually in different rooms and finally in the rooms at Kew where the last years of her life were spent. The rooms where the sound of a keyboard in the evening was one of the few continuities that connected the 74-year-old woman to the 12-year-old girl who had sat at the keyboard at Miro and played for her mother. She was not the glamorous figure that popular culture has made of her. She was small and by most accounts not conventionally beautiful, with features that observers described as strong rather than delicate, a face with more character than perfection. She was funnier in private than the formal record suggests. She was sharper than the role of dutiful consort required her to appear. She had the kind of dry, observational intelligence that the English call wit and that coexisted in her character with the piety and the practicality, in a combination that the people who knew her found both reliable and occasionally surprising. She died at Kew Palace in November of 1818. She was 74 years old. Several of her surviving children were with her. She was buried at Windsor, in St. George's Chapel. The king, entirely incapacitated and unaware of the world around him, lived her by 2 years, dying in January of 1820. Having been absent from the reality of his own life for the better part of a decade, what she left behind was a dynasty that would shape the next 2 centuries of the British monarchy. Her granddaughter Victoria would reign for 63 years and give her name to an age. Her descendants would sit on the thrones of Britain and Germany and Russia and Spain, their marriages connecting the royal houses of Europe in a web that held the continent together until the catastrophe of the First World War tore it apart. The 15 children Charlotte bore were the foundation of a royal family that persists to this day, and the German piety and practical competence that Elizabeth Albertine had instilled in Charlotte at Miro Castle passed through the generations in ways the family's historians have not always recognized. She left her name scattered across the maps of the English-speaking world. Charlotte, North Carolina, named for her in 1768, would grow into one of the largest cities in the American South. Charlottesville, Virginia, named in the same decade, would become famous for the university Thomas Jefferson built there. Mecklenburg County in North Carolina preserves the name of the duchy she came from. Queen Charlotte Sound in New Zealand preserves the name Captain Cook gave it in her honor. These names were chosen because she was the queen, which was enough, and because the British colonial world named things after its monarch as a matter of routine. Scattering the queen's name across territories Charlotte would never see, and that bore no resemblance to the flat grey lake country of her childhood. She left botanical knowledge that is still valued. The plant collections she helped establish at Kew, developed with the advice of Joseph Banks, grew into one of the great scientific institutions in the world. A living repository whose scope reflected the Queen's own intellectual seriousness about the natural world. Her botanical drawings survive and display the particular quality of attention she had brought to her observation of plants since childhood, the same attention she had first trained on the marsh flowers along the lakeside path at Miro. The line between the girl who drew wildflowers by a Baltic lake and the queen who helped build a world-class botanical garden is a line that the history of her life draws clearly, even if the history books have not always bothered to follow it. She left charitable institutions. The Queen Charlotte's and Chelsea Hospital, founded in her lifetime and named for her, continued to serve the women and children of London long after her death. Her charitable work was practical and sustained rather than ceremonial, grounded in the conviction her mother had modeled, that the fortunate have a genuine responsibility toward those who are not, and that the responsibility is discharged through actual provision rather than through sentiment. She left a correspondence in German and English that reveals a mind considerably more interesting than the dutiful consort that history has generally made of her. The letters show a woman who was wide and sharp and capable of the kind of dry observation that sits comfortably alongside genuine piety and a commitment to duty. She was not one thing. She was many things at once, as people are, and the reduction of her to a single dimension, whether the dutiful German wife or the glamorous queen of color, does her the disservice that every reduction does to a life actually lived. And she left the paintings that hang in the galleries, including the one we started with, the one in ivory satin with the composed expression and the dark powdered hair and the features that every generation examines with its own particular question forming. The painting is still there. It will be there tomorrow and the day after that. But sincere, people will keep stopping in front of it and looking too closely and asking the question that the paint cannot answer. And the question in the end is not really about Charlotte at all. It is about us, about what we need history to contain, about the gap between the past we have been given and the past that was actually lived, in all its complexity and its mixing and its refusal to stay inside the categories that every age imposes on the reality of ancestry and identity and the long, slow crossing of peoples across centuries and borders. Tonight you have followed a thread from a gallery in London back through the centuries. to a modest castle on the Baltic coast and a girl learning keyboard music beside a flat grey lake. A girl who walked the lakeside path in all weathers and drew the plants she found there with the accuracy of a scientific observer and sat in the cold chapel each morning smelling tallow and stone and old incense. To the Slavic warriors of the Obertracht Confederation, who were Charlotte's oldest traceable ancestors, who fished the same lakes and worshipped in sacred groves that no longer exist, and who were converted and absorbed into the German feudal world by a process they did not choose. To the Mecklenburg dukes who emerged from that absorption and married their way into the great web of European nobility across 7 centuries of patient alliance. To the courts of early Portugal and the long southward march of the Reconquista. To the conquered Algarve, where the whitewashed walls of Faro met the Atlantic light and the fishermen went out each morning as they had always gone out and the farmers maintained the irrigation channels as they had always maintained them, and the knowledge of 5 centuries of life. Islamic civilization persisted in the hands of the people who held it. To a woman called Madragana, who may have been the daughter of a Moorish governor and who may have been something else entirely, whose name carries the sound of Arabic, and whose children spread through the nobility of Europe across 5 centuries until they reached a girl in ivory satin who never knew this story existed. The chain is long, the certainties are few, the questions are many, and they are worth asking with care and with honesty, and the history that surrounds them is complicated enough and human enough and real enough to resist any resolution that satisfies everyone entirely. If you enjoyed following this story through the centuries, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. There are more stories to tell, more lives to follow, more candles to light. And if you know someone who loves Bridgerton, or Queen Charlotte, or the deeper history behind the drama they have watched on screen, please share this with them. The gallery will close for the evening. The lights will dim, the faces on the walls will recede into their frames, and the painting will remain where it has always been. The young woman in ivory satin, quiet and composed, keeping whatever she knew about herself in the place where the paint meets the canvas, where no amount of looking and no amount of argument can quite reach it. The question will remain too, as it has remained for 2.5 centuries, waiting for the next person to lean in a little too close, and to wonder, and to begin